Hi, I'm Jeff Colgan, Director of the Climate Solutions Lab here at the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs and Brown University. And I'm delighted to open our event today on climate change and global warming as it relates to the Middle East. Before I introduce our speakers, let me just say a word about the Climate Solutions Lab. It is a new unit this year at Brown University with multiple goals, one of which is to investigate and identify policies at the national and global level that can build political support for and remove obstacles to technical and economic solutions to climate change. And often this involves looking not just to climate experts, but also other experts with climate adjacent knowledge. And that's what we're doing today. Today, we are very lucky to have two tremendous experts in their field, one of whom is my colleague, Nadia Al-Ali, who is the Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology, and also the Director of the Center for Middle East Studies. And joining her today is Wael Al-Dalemi, who is a multidisciplinary epidemiologist and a professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Public Health at the University of California in San Diego. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and I'm very happy for this collaboration. I mean, I am by no means an expert on climate change, but I am directing the Center for Middle East Studies, and climate change is not only important to me personally, but it's of course something that's very relevant in the context of the Middle East. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our guest today, Professor Wael Al-Dalemi. Wael Al-Dalemi is Professor of Public Health and Associate Director of the Institute for Public Health at the University of California, San Diego, and the Chair of the Board of Directors for the Society for Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab World. He is also the current Chair of the Eastern Mediterranean chapter of the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology. A native of Iraq, where he finished his medical degree and a graduate diploma in community medicine, he obtained his PhD in epidemiology from New Zealand, finished postdoctoral training at Harvard School of Public Health, was a scientist with the International Agency for Research on Cancer before becoming a faculty at the University of California, San Diego. His recent research focus has been on climate change health impacts and global mental health. His book that he edited with colleagues titled Health of People, Health of Planet, and Our Responsibility was published in May 2020 by Springer Nature and reached a record milestone of more than 230,000 downloads. Welcome, Wael. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Nadia.
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking about the Middle East in relation to climate change and the environment, I mean, what immediately comes to mind are water shortages, conflicts over water distribution, but also extreme heat waves, as well as pollution and environmental damage linked to wars. I mean, we both share this Iraq connection, and I'm aware of some of the devastating impacts on the environment, that were caused by the various wars. But I mean, overall, it appears that the Middle East seems to be particularly vulnerable when it comes to climate change. And I assume this is a combination of geographical factors and possibly inherent climate factors, but also human-made factors. So, war, conflict, pollution, and so on. So I'm wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit on the reasons for the specific vulnerabilities of the region in terms of climate change.
Yes, Nadia, I mean, this is a relatively new area in terms of looking at climate change in this area in the Middle East, or I don't even like the Middle East per se, because it's a name that was used in the region by colonial powers, and we would say the Western Asian or the Eastern Mediterranean or the Arab world, whatever of these combinations. But I think most people know what Middle East is, so that's why it's used. But this area is really in the middle of a crisis on multiple levels. The crisis we all hear about in terms of conflicts, in terms of refugees. It's interesting that me and you didn't meet before, but we both go back to that heritage in Iraq and Baghdad. There are reasons for many of us and our generations, or the generations before us, who left, and it's going to be more or worse with the climate change impacts, because climate change is something that is slow, and people don't immediately associate what's happening to their water or their heat waves, or the low agricultural output to climate. So that's where the problem is. But there are enough scientific evidence that shows and predicts that the Middle East is going to be hard hit, or is already being hard hit, and it's going to be even worse for multiple reasons that you mentioned some of them. And if you ask people living there, through friends, relatives, or others, they will tell you it's getting hotter, and it's getting, each summer they're reaching records. And this is unfortunately one of the major problems that's going to hit this. Just a week ago, there was a paper that showed again some prediction that it will not be, it would be unlivable for many months, a year in many of these areas because of the extreme heat. And so that extreme heat is going to have an impact where people have to move or have to find other ways to kind of live in other places during these periods of heat that is extreme. That also has an impact on rain, on water. And so without water, people can't do any agriculture. They don't have access to good water. They don't have sanitation. Water is everything. That also creates a conflict. So then you can see a vicious cycle being created. And this is only going to get worse because of climate change.
Yes, I mean, I do remember visiting my relatives in Baghdad. It's quite a while ago in July. And, I grew up in Germany, and I mean, I still don't understand Fahrenheit, but in Celsius, it was something. It was definitely above 50 degrees Celsius. And, at the time, there was air conditioning. At the time, water was readily available. But, just thinking about, the last decades when you have this intense heat for so many months of the year, and as you say, it seems to be getting worse, and then not have electricity and not have water. I mean, that sounds really, really difficult. Before I continue, I just wanted to actually remind everyone, actually not remind, I forgot to mention that we will be in conversation for a while, but then we're very happy to take questions from the audience. So if you're joining us via the webinar, you can put in the question in the Q&A function. If you're joining us via the YouTube channel, you can also put the question there and we'll have access to it. And I should also say that the event is being simultaneously interpreted into Arabic. And so if you feel more comfortable with Arabic, you can use the Arabic channel under the interpretation function. Well, you already mentioned water, Wael, and I understand that the Middle East is, I mean, you wrote it in your work, but also people have said that it's probably the first region in the world that is going to run out of fresh water. And that seems to be terrifying given the extreme heat. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that danger, and how imminent is it?
Yes, I think anybody following closely the news even today in the Middle East, they will notice there is a lot of tension and almost threatening of wars related to water. So every day, every other day, there is something about the big dam in Ethiopia that is blocking the Nile water from Sudan and Egypt. And both these countries are threatening war, threatening violence. And, it's already, there's violence in Ethiopia, for example. And so this is a very clear indicator. Egypt is saying the Nile is our life. We depend on it for everything. If it decreases, there isn't enough water, then we could go into famine. And actually, historically, this happened when the Nile receded many decades ago, or centuries ago, and there was famine that devastated Egypt. So this is an indication. This is one of the main rivers in the region. The other two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq, has the same situation, where the tributaries of water from Iran is being blocked, so it doesn't go to Iraq because they want to use the water, and that is increasing the salinity and decreasing the levels of the Tigris. And the Euphrates, the same thing. There are dams being put in Turkey that is decreasing the water, and there's tension about this. They're trying to negotiate it. It's kind of a little bit more reasonable than what's happening in Ethiopia. So these are the main rivers. What about the rest of the region? They are dependent on rain in the coastal areas, or more on underground water. The problem with underground water is that it takes several years to replenish what is used, several years of rain, so that it's replenished. At the rate at these countries now in the region, they are using the underground water more than that it can be replenished. So as a result, there is a deficit. And this deficit is going to get worse and worse and worse. And one of the first countries that we're seeing this deficit in is Yemen. So Yemen is dependent on water, rainwater, for agriculture, as well as underground water. And both of them, and there is conflict, and there's poverty. And that deficiency is leading to people not having enough income, having to fight over water. And so these are all going to get worse with climate change unless we try and to do something about it now.
Yeah, and the problem is trying to do something about it now. I mean, what you're describing, there's the deficit that is linked to, well, the already existing conditions plus climate change. But then in terms of solutions, I mean, these are solutions that unfortunately every country seems to be trying to grab, the access to water. And I mean, it very much reminds me of what we're going through right now in terms of the pandemic, sort of this tendency to just sort of think in terms of the nation state, but something like climate or pandemic really need to be addressed in a transnational, international manner. And I think that's part of the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the region has been divided up since World War II, and actually World War I, and that dividing up on political, and borders that didn't exist, have made it really worse in terms. There's always territorial conflict. There's always competition instead of working with each other. And there is the rooms to work with each other. But as you mentioned, the politics of the region is not very healthy at all. And there isn't that much cooperation. I'm always delighted when I see, there's some kind of a pack of several countries coming together to work about issues. It's always, delighting to hear, but that's very rare. I think a week ago, Saudi Arabia decided with Iraq and I think Egypt and some other country to grow several million trees in the region. They call it the Green Middle East or something. That's great. That's excellent. That's exactly what is needed in terms of people, governments working together, because that's going to serve the communities, fight climate change, and brings this cooperation, as you said. Now, it's really important to know that the region also complements each other in terms of, some countries have deficiencies in water, others deficiency in crops, others, have much higher weather, and they can cooperate and work with each other. But that's not happening at that level.
Yeah. Now I'm wondering, aside from the water shortages which already exist and seem quite imminent, what are some of the other acute risks, and what are more long-term or midterm risks in terms of the impacts of climate change?
Yes. So what's happening with the climate is as follows. We have seen an increase of 1 Celsius degree in the past 50 years or so. And that is going to keep on increasing if we continue on this trajectory. If we don't do anything, this is a global problem, not just the Middle East. And it's, the global warming is not generated specifically in the Middle East. It's generated here in the US, in Europe, because of the fuel, of the combustion, and so on. And these countries are culprits, or these regions, but the impact is everywhere. Whether it's in Africa or India or Middle East, and so it's all connected. But if we continue on this trajectory, by 2100, that's 80 years from now, the worst case scenario is that we will go to 4 Celsius increase. So you can see that could be, devastating in terms of what's going to happen with everything else. If we do go on that scenario, then everything that we are seeing now that is, subtle or chronic is going to be acute, is going to be devastating. So, for example, what we are now seeing is a few days a year where the temperatures are exceeding the normal range, beyond the normal range for any country. Again, in Kuwait, they broke a record, I believe, last year. In Iraq, they're breaking records of temperatures in the summer. So this.
Sorry, can you just tell us a little bit in Fahrenheit for our audience what this might be?
So in Fahrenheit, that's close to 120 or more, 125 Fahrenheit. That's, around 60 Celsius, 56 to 60 Celsius. So this could happen, on a day, and then it goes back. So people can adopt or accommodate that. But if it stays more than 6 days continuously, then it is very damaging to the everything, including health, including electricity, not being able to cope with all the air conditioning. So the longer these spells, the more devastating. I'll just give you an example. In 2003, the one of the best documented heat waves in Europe in 2003, and I was actually in France there working with the WHO. It stayed 9 days. The heat wave stayed 9 days. It caused an estimated 30,000 excess deaths because of these 9 days. And the temperature didn't reach, 120. it reached around 95 or 100 Fahrenheit, which you could say, why? Well, because Europe is not used to this temperature, and there is no air conditioning, and people were in their apartments kind of suffering silently and lonely, and they died, mostly elderly. So that is what's going to happen more acutely afterwards. I mean, as we go further, now we're having heat waves of several days in this region or in some of these countries. It could be up to 6 months a year, worst case scenario, in 2100. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, even Iraq, they would have all the summer, several months of the summer, that it is in these ranges, which people cannot live. Now, I mentioned this once. I was visiting Kuwait, and one of the Kuwaiti colleagues said, well, we're used to heat. We're always used to heat, so it's not a big deal. I said, yes, you are used to, because you have electricity, you have air conditioning, but what about those workers who are in the street? What about people, the policemen? What about, can you cover all that with air conditioning? It becomes unlivable. And I ask, what if the electricity breaks down? Can you tolerate that? And so, that person was silent. So it's really, the situation is beyond our imagination in terms of how devastating it is. That's why we need to act now.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, acting now also requires, well, I mean, aside from we're going to talk about, I want to ask you about sort of the political will, but also
Yes.
in terms of just people, society, I guess, a certain consciousness about it. And I mean, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, my impression has always been that although there is sort of a growing awareness, but with all the problems going on in the Middle East, particularly, in Iraq, clearly wars and conflict, but across the region, there's lots of displacement, poverty, authoritarian repression. So in that context, I mean, climate change almost seems like a luxury. I mean, that's kind of the way that people might perceive it. But of course, when everything that you just described, it's not luxury, it's an urgency. So I'm wondering, I mean, I know that you're involved in an association, that is thinking around these issues. And, what are some of the ways that you and others are trying to raise consciousness about climate change in the region? And I'm particularly interested also in the kind of frameworks that you evoke. I mean, are there sort of specific cultural, historically rooted, and also maybe religious teachings that resonate particularly well in the region, and that you use in terms of telling people that this is the time to act, we can't wait any longer?
Yes, I mean, and I have to complete the answer for your previous question about the acute and chronic, and I mentioned, the heat is the one that we're feeling, but also the sandstorms and desert storms are becoming much more frequent. So this is also related to climate. And I mentioned, the water and all that. These are the acute. The more chronic ones, long term, are going to be mass movement by refugees. There's going to be hunger, and we're already seeing this in Yemen because of lack of water and agriculture and lack of income and poverty. And there's going to be more conflict. So, there are a lot of problems that are going to happen long term that are really going to put things even in a worse context. Now, what we're trying to do, so as scientists, we are limited. We can't control the politics. We can't change what's going on. It's way beyond us. But at least we can try and help in several fronts. First, try and give scientific evidence for policymakers and governments where needed. That is one of our roles. And also to try and educate the public. That's also one of our roles. One of the reasons we brought together the Society for Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab world, we put it together in 2010, was really about not just climate, but about everything related to science, and why this region, which flourished and was the beacon of science in during the Islamic civilization, and even way beyond it, from the Babylonians and others, and then it degraded, is because of lack of, or because of the politics, honestly. So as our society is, we're, a lot of the expatriates from the region want to give back, and that's where we put the society together to try and develop curriculum, training, education, and also address misinformation in public. Like with COVID-19, we have tried to put out statements about COVID-19. I've done a few YouTubes about, the misinformation about the importance of vaccine, because the region, unfortunately, suffers from lack of trust of the media, and they're depending more on social media, and the social media does not have the science. Everybody's making their own opinion, and climate change is definitely, as you mentioned earlier, is on the backstage. It's the least thing that comes up in discussion, because they say, oh, we have a lot of things to worry about. But climate change is going to be the number one worry in a few decades, and that's why we are trying to raise its profile now.
Well, what you described, Wael, in terms of people's lack of trust in the media, and having to educate people about COVID-19 and other issues. I mean, I think there is this kind of conspiracy thinking, but it seems to me that that is not unique to the region, but that seems to be actually prevalent across, and is very much present in the United States, but also in Europe. So I think that that's quite interesting how some of the exceptionalism that we used to associate, or at least some people associated with the Middle East on the one hand, or the US on the other hand, is actually needs to be challenged on so many levels. Before I'm going to move to the audience questions, I guess I'd like to ask you, what would you like to see happen? I mean, in terms of the concrete actions, both that individual citizens can do, but also what should happen on national levels, international levels. What are some of the things that you would like to see happen?
Yes, I think there are possibly two levels that needs to address this. First of all, in terms of climate, there are two approaches to it, either adaptation or mitigation. And adaptation means as the word says, adapting to the situation. For example, creating heat wave alerts so that people will know that there's a heat wave and they have to take precautions, providing safe places for people who don't have air conditioning, doing all of these things to prevent the health impacts of heat waves. Adaptation in terms of trying to think of how can we address the impacts of, desert storms or sandstorms, or the decrease in water by changing agricultural practice and so on. The mitigation, which is more of the long term, is what can we do now to try and, not completely, we can't completely shut off all the impacts of climate, but at least decrease its impact. And this is more of behavior of people as well as policies by governments. They go hand in hand. So behavior by itself is for people to change is really important, but it's not enough by itself. We don't also want to wait and depend on governments to pass policies. We have to begin from our own home, from our own society and community. One of the things we want to do is change, where possible, how we eat, the food not being wasted, because it's all a cycle. When 40 in the US, 40% of the food produced is wasted. That took a lot of energy, a lot of water, and a lot of manpower and so on. And then it all went to the dump. So if we don't waste, then we are saving the planet. Depending on types of energy that are not going to increase the pollution, that are not going to increase the climate change by shifting into more renewable energy. And it's happening, for example, in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're trying to move into that direction. These are more of a policy level. In terms of agriculture, sustainable agriculture, how can we depend less on the usual practices of irrigation and using the groundwater, which is not replenished, and then we end up with not having even water to drink. 70% of the water that is used globally, the fresh water, goes to irrigation. And so that is a place where people can begin thinking of sustainable agriculture and water to address short-term and long-term. All of these are scientifically proven evidence that could help. And that's why there is a need for dependence on people who are researchers or scientists who will be able to provide the sound advice and projection for behavior as well as policy. And that's where we see this cooperation between scientists, governments, and people.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm now going to turn to the audience questions. And the first question is from Elizabeth Gripkop, who asks, what will be the health impacts from the kind of heat waves forecasted in this region later in this century? And actually following up on Elizabeth's question, I mean, I actually wanted to ask you about your work on mental health, because I think that is so important. And, I'm not at all an expert into either climate change or medicine or mental health, but to my mind, it seems that what we are witnessing in terms of epidemic proportions is a mental health crisis across the globe for different reasons. And I mean, I know, for example, in Iraq, there are very concrete reasons why people are engaged in this constant state of trauma because of so many wars and conflict. I know you've written on displacement and the health, including mental health of refugees. But clearly, there are also mental health implications in terms of climate change. So if you could speak to that question, please.
Yes. So in terms of the heat waves and health impacts, direct health impacts, one of the few clear evidence or direct evidence of climate change on health is heat waves, because all the other impacts, whether it's flooding, sorry, I'm going to turn off my phone. So all the other impacts are more subtle or indirect. Even the infectious diseases spread because of vectors, because it's warm, so they travel to other areas and they increase the infectious disease, or flooding causing contaminated water and all that. Heat waves are more direct. There's a heat wave, there's a health impact within a day or a few days. And these affect mostly people with existing chronic diseases, elderly, those who cannot decompensate, by their body cannot tolerate so much heat wave. So that is people with cardiovascular disease, people with diabetes, people with renal disease, people with respiratory disease. All of those people who have pre-existing conditions are going to suffer, and as well as the very young, those who don't realize that they are, losing fluids and water because of the heat wave, and they succumb into severe illnesses as a result. Relatedly, those with mental illnesses are also going to be impacted the most by heat waves because they are less adapting, they are less interested in their health, and they don't they don't realize it until it's too late. So that's answering the question, but also to your point, mental health is going to be the most devastating problem, and also the most less visible. Mental illnesses are less visible than physical illnesses, and the trauma from being displaced. And we wrote this in our book, a chapter on the psychological impacts of climate change. It is devastating for people to leave, people to lose their homes. Like in California, we have had the worst wildfires in the history of the state last summer. And these wildfires, they burn towns down, the whole town. And so that has a major long-term trauma. When people lose their loved ones or their belonging, that has so much impact. And the trauma of flooding, same thing. The trauma of displacement and refugees in the region, we know that the region contributes to one of the largest percentages of refugees in the world, especially because of the Syrian crisis, which is the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. So all of these are related to trauma and mental illnesses. And that's why I am personally very interested in trying to raise awareness about this impact that is a hidden impact of climate.
Yeah. And it has also, of course, been a hidden impact of the pandemic of COVID-19 across the globe. So, there are lots of different reasons. We know it's also in terms of economic crisis. I mean, there's so many different layers to this issue, isn't there? Well, I'm going to, if it's okay with you, I'm going to read out 2 questions now, and they're somewhat linked. One also by Elizabeth Skripkov, who's asking, what climate adaptation measures are leaders in this region already doing? I mean, you spoke about it already, but maybe you can elaborate. And what additional adaptation will need to happen given the projections for worsening heat waves and droughts later this century? And how are policymakers helping citizens from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who can't afford air conditioning? I mean, that's a good question. And then Rawan Araj asked, are there examples of mitigation initiatives from other regions that can be adapted in the Middle East?
Yes, so I mean, the governments of the region have signed up to the Paris Agreement, and they are aware of this, because this is a national security for many of them. And some countries like Morocco, as well as Saudi Arabia and UAE, these are some of the governments that have policies and looking, on implementing it to address the climate change in general. In terms of heat waves, I am not fully aware of any specific programs, systems of public health that address it in terms of setting an alert, setting a campaign, or providing safe places for people. The desert storms, they are regular in the region. They're increasing in frequency, but there isn't much of a system of, okay, what are the health impacts in terms of increasing asthma to the emergency room because of that, or people with respiratory illnesses, etc. I am not aware of that. There might be, but as far as I know, at least in the public literature and the policies that we are aware of, there isn't something that is systematic. There are policies, and some of these policies might not be implemented. I know Jordan has a global climate change policy for many years, and policies are good as long as they are enforced and implemented. So I think the region is behind. What are the things we can learn? There are many examples. Again, even in Asia, even in India, and of course in Canada and the US, there are very well accepted scientific evidence of what are the mitigation and adaptation policies that are going to be taken in relation to these aspects, including heat wave, and as the most devastating or the more clear impacts for the Middle East. And I think there needs to be an active process of addressing this, projecting it. I think there is lack of science of how bad it is in this region compared to the others. And so people are saying, oh yeah, we're used to heat waves, but it's not going to be your usual heat wave. And so that's one of the challenges, I think, that people are not taking it seriously. And the governments are aware of it, but they are not enforcing it. They're not putting it on the top of their agenda. And as you said, focusing on other things. There will be a lot of impacts down the road unless we begin to work together as a region, or they work together as a region and governments to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple more questions from the audience, one by Alberto Bortoni. Is it possible that desalination plants, excuse me, can be implemented as a general solution to the water shortage problem, just as Saudi Arabia does? It seems that without generating drinking water, natural water supplies will be treated as oil 2.0, and with it another century of endless wars. Anur Qasim, many thanks for addressing this vitally important subject. It is known that there is much apprehension, if not plain prejudice, that world over regarding the Middle East. Yet the people, culture, and psyche of the cradle of civilization are an important facet of humanity. So preservation of not just people, but culture and the religious values intrinsic to it are important to safeguard. With climate change, the future looks like there will also be people displaced from seafront areas. The projections are to the tune of 250 to 300 million people within the next 3 to 5 years. So how do we ensure that people displaced are eased into safe, livable areas of the world? And how do we make it all workable as well as practical? How will costs be met? Who foots the bill? How do we ensure more than just refugee status for those displaced? How do we safeguard already long compromised respect for those who will not only literally be at the mercy of the elements, but face issues of transport, safe living spaces, income generating opportunities, integration into newer cultures? Okay, so this is kind of a talk in and of itself. It's a very, very comprehensive question, but maybe see what you can do while within the limited time we have.
Yes, I forgot the first question because of the long second question. What was the first question?
Yes, so the first question was about desalination plants in Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Yeah, desalination is not a long-term solution for many reasons. It's very expensive, so not everyone can afford it. It is devastating to the environment, ecology, and it's it's something that can contribute, but it shouldn't be the solution. Some of the best solutions is reuse of water. And we did a study on in the West Bank and occupied Palestine a few years back, looking at acceptability of using gray water. Gray water is the water that goes from the faucet, not from the toilet. That's called black water, and that that could be used after treatment to maybe for plants and others. But for our own use, the gray water is what goes from the faucet. Like taking a shower or using to wash hands or from the kitchen. And so that water can be treated and reused, not necessarily for drinking, but for many other uses at home. And that is a very sustainable, very effective way to replenish our water use. So that would be one of the things that people can invest. And we even asked and looked and we published about this, about the Islamic perspective and acceptability of gray water, given that 91 or more of that region are Muslims. What does Islam say about that? And it was very clear that gray water is acceptable, since if after treatment it doesn't have a very it doesn't have a bad taste or smell, then it's acceptable for everything. So the only thing that was the obstacle is the cost, and it's a minimal cost compared to desalination. But people can do it in their own homes and do this treatment. But it's too costly. It was too costly for people in the West Bank. Now the second long question, I guess, focuses on displacement, especially regarding flooding. And so the coastal areas, especially in Al-Maghrib al-Arabi, in what's called North Africa, and that is very dependent on the coast. All the cities are on the coast, and also in the Mediterranean. So if there is, there will be increase in sea level, then there will be flooding of these low-lying places near the coast. And it is expected that 150 million people will be displaced in the coming decades as a result of that. The best solution is not to encourage or plan for those people to migrate, to other countries. If there are solutions within each country, that is the best solution, because then the agony and the challenges of displacement are mitigated and become less because they're moving within their own country. So that's one of the things that governments can begin to plan and say, okay, within 20 years, these areas are going to be flooded. And so we have to begin planning for how to move this town or the people to other places. Now, if that's not going to happen, people are just going to take boats or just walk, like happened in Syria, and move to Europe or anywhere where they want to, have a safer place. And so that is a cost of climate change that the world have to accept and have to be prepared for, unfortunately, unless we, again, do these things. And so instead of blaming the refugees and discriminating, not accepting, and all of these, we have to think why they were displaced in the first place, because of our actions, because of how we use energy, because of how we waste food. All of these cycles are connected. So it needs cooperation, full stop. That's what it needs. It's a global phenomenon, and we have to all work together. Like the pandemic, I mean, everybody more or less for the COVID had to work with each other. They have to, quarantine together, have to communicate and provide science to everyone about the vaccine effectiveness. This is the same approach that we need to address climate change.
Yeah, although we see the limitations in terms of, the cooperation in terms of people fighting over the vaccination, and but yeah, I mean, clearly that is needed, collaboration. I actually want to pick up on something you mentioned. You mentioned Islam and some of the underlying teachings, and I noticed in your writings you mentioned that Islam is supportive of an anthropogenic origin of climate change, and I was wondering if you can explain that.
Yes. So in the Quran, the holy text of the book, there is actually a reference to this in a verse, and I have it in the book. So I guess we didn't talk about the book, which is the basis of why we have this. This was published, and I'm going to show it. So this book was published last year, and by a group of us scientists, including climate scientists, health scientists, and faith leaders. And it had 33 chapters, including the chapter on the Middle East, which I wrote as well as the psychological impacts of climate change. And in the chapter that I wrote, and this is freely can be downloaded from Amazon and everywhere. We made it freely available. So in the chapter I wrote about the Middle East, I came across this, and I want to read it. So it says in chapter 30 of the Quran, verse 41, corruption has appeared in the land and the sea on account of what the hands of men have wrought. that he may make them taste a part of that which they have done, so that they may return. And so this is an anthropogenic origin of corruption. Here is, the damage, and it was done by man, and that they will taste the outcome of what happened. This is in the book of the Quran chapter, and then the beginning of the verse in Arabic, for those who are Arabic speaking, ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر, and it goes on. I don't memorize the verse, but the corruption has appeared in the seas and the lands. And so people can find that verse. I'm sure they were not aware of it or linking it to climate, but it is something that I came across, and I thought, wow, this is speaking exactly to the situation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, as you say, in the context where there's a Muslim majority, it is important to find those, historically, culturally rooted frames that speak to people. Okay, we're running out of time, but I'm actually going to call on my colleague here at Brown, Jeff Colgan, who has a question that also links to health. Jeff, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Wael, for your talk today. I wanted to call attention to maternal health and the effects that climate change can have on it. In the United States, studies are showing that extreme heat create problems for pregnancies and maternal health. And moreover, this is a racialized effect, with Black mothers more harshly affected than white mothers. And so I wonder whether you expect similar climate effects in Iraq and the Persian Gulf region.
Yes, of course, whatever health impacts we find in the US, we're going to find it elsewhere. The difference might be there's more, let's call it, a little bit more tolerance, let's call it, of pregnant women in these regions to the heat, for example, compared to somebody in suburban US city where they are less tolerant to that. That being said, it's all relative. So whatever it's warm in the Middle East, it's going to be warmer, and so that is going to have an impact that will impact pregnant women over there as well as anywhere. The problem, of course, is that in the Middle East, we have very rich countries and very poor countries. And so there will be this kind of difference where people or countries that have or afford air conditioning are going to be able to sustain this longer, not indefinitely. They will be impacted. They will be impacted when the electrical grid breaks down, when the heat waves becomes too much, or when not a worker can be outside in the heat. So this will cause a standstill. But then the other countries that don't have the monies and to support its citizens, that's going to be more damaging. And then within these countries, those who are the most poor, and maybe not on racial, but on poverty and income, are going to be impacted the most. People who are in rural areas, people who are not educated about why this is devastating to your health, to your newborn, and therefore there is no data. I mean, that's the challenge. There is no scientific data to know the impacts. And science is really what drives sound policies. And without the science and evidence, we don't know. So if we don't know what's going on, what is the impact, we don't have the the trigger to do something about it.
Yeah, thank you, Wael. I mean, I from listening to you and also everything else I know, I suspect that climate change and global warming does precisely what other crises, again, I'm thinking about the pandemic. I mean, it shows it very much brings to light the pre-existing inequalities. So here, pre-existing inequalities between countries. I mean, some countries in the region are already struggling much more for various reasons than others. Inequalities within countries, you know, we have inequalities based on class. We have, of course, ethnic and religious minorities, inequalities based on gender. I mean, something like
Yes.
maternal health. And so, you know, I suspect that climate change and global warming is going to do both highlight those inequalities and worsen them, unless, you know, we mitigate against those. And also listening to you, while I think it's so tricky, isn't it? Speaking about climate change, to, on the one hand, educate people, raise consciousness, without creating a sense of doom and gloom that people think, well, we can't do anything about it, right? So it's like, clearly things need to happen at international level. Clearly things need to happen on the level of national governments, big corporations. But what is it that me, you know, I myself, Nadir Ali, can do? And I think that I find it really tricky to, for myself, I'm always struggling with that. And I assume this is also one of the biggest challenges that you're facing. I am going to thank you. I know there are other questions, but we've run out of time. I know you have a meeting directly afterwards. You have a very busy day. So I very much would like to thank you, Wael, for joining us, for educating us. And, you know, we will make this available both in English and Arabic. So hopefully this will be accessible to a wider range of audience. And thank you very much, Jeff, for co-hosting the event.
Thank you both for a great contribution.
And thank you for having this opportunity. I think this is important for the local people in the region, especially that it's going to be in Arabic. And I can tell you, it's not doom and gloom. We can do something about it, but we just have to work now and work within our own family, how we behave, and then build on that. Through education. And so that's why we put the book as a reference in a lay language where people can understand and what to do about it. So every problem we have in each chapter, we have the solutions for. So it's definitely, we need to act, and it's preventable.
Thank you very much. Great. So goodbye, everyone. And thank you also. Thank you for the audience for joining us, and